Hey folks, greetings from the Offensive Security Group here at Secure IT 360, coming at you with a new episode of the Cyber Threat Perspective. You've got myself, Spencer, and Brad here today to talk about an interesting topic, hackers, how we get in and how to stop us. And I'm going to let Brad introduce kind of the topic and what we're going to be talking about in more detail. But as always, if you find this podcast is useful to you, if you get value, if you get an insight from this, let us know, give us some feedback, rate us on all your favorite podcast apps, share, like, subscribe, all the cool, fun stuff that the kids are doing this day. So we appreciate it. It really helps us out. So yeah, Brad, what are we talking about today?
Yeah, man. So this is really exciting to me because, we do hundreds of penetration tests every year. We did the math on it, and it was really surprising how many we actually completed. So the question kind of came up was, out of all the things that we do and all the tests that we perform, how do we get in the most, right? What is our most successful method of initial access? And we want to clarify initial access because we have hundreds and hundreds of different techniques and TTPs, but there are certain things that tend to get us into organizations from the outside. And so, we kind of bubbled the list up to the top, and we ended up, selecting three things that were consistently outperforming other methods, to an order of magnitude, by the way. Like the first one that we're going to talk about is like 80% or something,
right,
of our successful attacks. And so, I should also note that, we're big fans of MITRE here, and we utilize them to a large degree. But we have left out certain initial access things, not only because, they wouldn't have made the list, but also because they don't fit well into a red team / pen test environment, or they don't facilitate themselves well. And the easiest example is like drive-by attacks, right? We don't do that because it's frowned upon to go hack like WebEx in order to target this, firm that you want to pen test.
Right.
So we leave that stuff out.
Yeah, we're not out here doing supply chain attacks to show off,
Yeah, for sure. So the first technique that we use that is just wildly successful is credential attacks. And that may sound like super broad, so I'm going to narrow it down a little bit. There are two specific type of credential attacks that we use that net us a high level of success. The very first thing is called credential stuffing. And so before I dive into credential stuffing, let's talk about what a credential attack is. It's basically us logging into something. Like at a fundamental level, we're just logging into stuff. The question is, how do we successfully log into stuff, right? Well, we just go find usernames and passwords. And a credential stuffing attack is the process by which we go find compromised credentials, right? So let's say that your users in your organization use Facebook. Okay. So they all go create business accounts on Facebook. Well, Facebook gets hacked and the credentials are compromised, meaning the password, either in hashed or plain text form, kind of spills out onto the internet. Right. And so we collect that information. We leverage a couple of different resources. Basically, we crawl the dark web and we, gather all that up. And then we use those usernames and passwords to attempt to log into your stuff.
Yep.
Right.
And what's interesting too is how many people, listening to this, I've done it myself, have used the same password for multiple sites, right?
Oh yeah.
Like I use,
we're betting on it, man.
That's the bet here is that these credentials that we find, we are willing to, bet, and it's, proven through our penetration tests that, time after time again, users will use the same password or a similar password on multiple services. So that's part of the reason as well, that you're going to discuss of why this is so, such a powerful technique and why it gets us access so many times.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And, to be also just kind of keep going down that road on the credential stuffing piece is credential compromises are, there's a ticking time clock on these, right? So from the moment that they're released publicly, you as an organization need to reset those credentials on any corporate systems. The longer those sit out there, the more likely they are to be used. And also from an attacker perspective, credentials that have been out there for a year are basically worthless, right? So when we do this, we're looking for fresh stuff. Like generally we're like 6 months, We'll look back 6 months, we'll grab all those creds and we'll try to log into your stuff with those creds. And so, those are just things to keep in mind, right? Like if you're not doing dark web monitoring on email accounts associated with your organization, how would you know that one of these were compromised, right? So,
Yep. And we use these credentials for not just the obvious, right? Logging into email, but we use these for other things, right? Like the entry point of where we use these credentials varies as well, based on the client, based on their tech stack. What are you finding is the most kind of the top things that you're logging into with those credentials?
365, G Suite, all that stuff. The email is literally the number one. Now, I will say also, and this is super scary, but we often find remote access credentials that match. And so that's a scary thing, right? Number one, if I can log into remote access, one, without MFA, and two, with an old set of credentials I found on a parking mobile app, then there are a lot of best practices that are not occurring, right, at that organization.
Yep.
So those are the two most common. Now we will branch out into other stuff too, right? So, to your point, we're betting that they're reusing these passwords. So we might go log into that user's Facebook. We might go log into that user's, if they have like Google Meet or something, maybe they're using O365, but they use, Zoom, for example, but they don't use integrated auth. Well, the problem with that is a lot of these platforms, they don't have password reset requirements.
Yep.
And a lot of them don't even have password policy requirements that adhere with the corporate password policy. So my Zoom password might literally be, Brad 2020 ! Right? Which I also at that time happened to set on my Walmart.com, credential. So, there's a lot of moving pieces to it.
Yep.
But yeah, usually email.
Yep.
So, the question then becomes, what do we do about it? Right? The number one thing I would tell you to do is enable MFA on everything. Right? We're living in a very dangerous time with public facing resources that you need to have MFA on literally everything. And I'm not saying, notice that the words I'm saying are important, not just the things you care about, everything. Because the ability to SSO or laterally move from one system to another is, it's not hard, right?
Yep.
And in a lot of cases, a air quotes not important system becomes a jump point for us where we will go attack other users, right? And then we just move from there. So yeah, everything. Number one, get rid of anything that you don't need, like from an attack surface perspective. Don't have 27 different logins to 27 different apps, right? SSO, MFA.
Yep. And it's not uncommon for us to do a security assessment or a pen test, and we go to the client and we're like, okay, what's your external footprint look like? And they're like, well, I'm not sure. I think it's these IPs, but I'm not sure. And like part of that pen test is the recon of finding things that the client didn't know that they had and saying, hey, you've got this thing. Did you know you had it? And either they do or they don't.
Yeah.
And oftentimes on assessments, we'll be looking at controls and things, and clients will say, well, I'm not really sure I use this, or I haven't used this in a while, but it's still out there. So there's a little bit of technical debt there that allows these things to happen as well.
Yeah. And that's a really good point. And we could do an entire podcast on just the subject of the things that aren't security that impact security, right? Asset management, change management, are the two biggest things because they're not sexy. People neglect them in their environments. And like you said, the technical debt of that is systems you don't patch and you don't know you have or you don't need.
Yep.
So number one thing is get rid of the stuff you don't need, right? And of the stuff that you do need, that you need to continue to maintain public access to, I say public internet access to, MFA that thing, right? And monitor it, set up policies, whatever it is, get with your MSSP and figure out how you can be alerted to password attacks, especially successful ones, right? If the same IP address fails to log in to 300 users and successfully logs into the 301st user, you have a serious problem and you need to know it. So make sure you have monitoring and alerting and all that good stuff. But also, user education is a big thing here, right?
Yeah.
In my experience, if you tell somebody specifically not to do something at work, they won't do it. So if you tell them, do not reuse your work passwords at other places, or create a company policy where you don't allow users to use company email on third-party sites, especially personal stuff, those are more likely to be compromised, then they probably won't do it, or at the very least, you can minimize how much they do it.
Right. Yep.
So that's one credential attack, right? There's another credential attack that is also wildly successful, and that is password spraying. So what's the difference between credential stuffing and password spraying? Well, password spraying is just a fancy way of guessing passwords. Humans are disgustingly consistent on bad passwords, right?
Yep.
Like how many of you listening right now have a password that is uppercase word followed by a number and a special character, like password 123 exclamation point, right? Those are crackable or guessable to a high degree of success. So we leverage human behavior in password spraying. And the way we get around like lockout policies and defensive mechanisms is we'll go set up API forwarders in AWS. We'll do like 5 of them, and they'll come from all over the world or all over the US, depending on whether you have context-based auth. And we'll say, okay, it is, 2022. So we'll do summer 2022 exclamation point.
Yep.
The number of the rate of success is embarrassing. That's the number that we get. And so, but they meet the password policy of 10 characters, special uppercase number, whatever. But they're bypassing the intent or the heart of the policy, right? Yeah. Which is to be non-predictable. So, but basically we'll go gather up emails in the same way that we do with credential stuffing. We'll carve them out of the dark web. We'll look on Google. We'll gather up all those emails, and then we'll try to log into every single email you have, or every single account that you have, with one password.
Yep.
And we'll do that every hour.
Yeah. And something I think is interesting too is users will maybe be a little bit smart, and they'll use something that's company related, or the location of the company, or a sports team that's in the area, right? So we'll scrape things from the website, right? We'll use tools to pull down words from the website, things that are demographically or geographically significant for those areas where the client does business. We'll use those as potential words in our word list. So yeah, all those things are things that you should educate users on, that attackers are actively doing, right? To try and guess passwords.
Yeah, one of the engagements we did last year, which I think perfectly illustrates this, was the domain admin, and this was an internal pen test, but the domain admin account, the password was the city the company was founded in, the year the company was founded, and an exclamation point. I think it took us 13 seconds using the scraping words we got off their main page. It took us 13 seconds to guess the password programmatically. And it was a pretty good password. It was like Atlanta 1974 at exclamation point, right? By all measurements, that's a good password, until you start using tools and techniques that take into consideration human predictability. And so then you start defeating those things. Even
longer passwords can be guessed, right? And we've cracked passphrases before because they're just common phrases or common dictionary words put together in a natural language sequence. So that's where the user education really comes in, is educating users what constitutes a strong password and how to construct those and how to manage them and use them, safely.
Yeah, and that's really all you need to do, is give the user some guidance, right? And this can also be a technology solution, right? Are you using, things like LastPass or KeyPass, or, I don't know exactly how many there are, but there are corporate managed versions of these lockboxes for passwords. And so if you're not using that, then you're not giving your users the tools to be successful. And so using that tool, I can go generate a 25 character randomly generated password that I never have to remember and don't even know. right?
Yep.
Like you could waterboard me and I couldn't tell you what my password is, right? I would be like, you got to go check my LastPass, bro, because I don't know. That is a win, right?
Yep.
Because we're taking the human element out of the credential.
The one downside is when you create a 99 character password for like your bank, right? And you go like, okay, sweet, 99 character password, great. They ask for security questions. You make these fake security questions, right?
Yes.
You're good. Okay, great, awesome. You're moving on your way. You finally get logged in, right? You log out, you go to log back in. Turns out you can't copy and paste the password.
Oh, yeah.
And then you got to type that 99 character password in on mobile because you're like on vacation and you're locked out of your bank or something. And you're like, you did it 16 times. Now you're locked out of your bank. And it's like, oh.
Yep. I've been there so many times. And my favorite, go ahead, you finish.
No, I was just going to, password managers are great up until websites don't allow you to copy and paste.
Well, and so like my favorite example is my Netflix password. When I created it, I didn't realize that I would have to type it into the TV. Right. So I've got like a 17 character randomly generated, like all these special characters. It took me 20 minutes to type that in using the keypad on the remote.
Yep.
It's such a mess.
But, yeah. And then you have like characters that look similar, like I and L, and it's like, is that capital?
Right. The font will just ruin you on that.
Yeah. Oh, it's a nightmare when the websites don't do that, but
for sure. So, but I will say, from a corporate setting perspective, I encourage people to use these password managers. They really do streamline it, and I love them the most because number one, they're cheap, right? Number two, they actually make it user friendly to have big passwords. So even if you had a passphrase before, it's still faster to click two things and log in. Yeah. And then number three, it just allows for impossible passwords that bad guys are never going to get. Yep. So big fan, huge mitigation, that and MFA, dude, and you should be rock solid.
Yep. Yeah, I'd rather have a 99 character password that I can never log into with than have my bank account get hacked into and lose all my money.
100% agree. 100% agree. And I do have to remind myself of that sometimes when I get frustrated with like, man, why do I have to do all this? Oh, that's right. Yeah, I don't want to get hacked. All right. So that kind of wraps up the credential attack. That is a super common thing. All these tools that we use are publicly available on GitHub and various other resources. You guys can do this against yourselves if you want to, right? But yeah, good, definitely good there. So moving on to the second most frequent method of attack is web application exploits. Now, this is near and dear to my heart. I'm a web app pen tester, like old school from back, before OWASP was a thing. And so, I'm passionate about this. And so maybe I attack web apps more on external pen tests than I should. I'm not sure. But what I have found is in a lot of cases, either homegrown applications, right? Or small vendor applications when you got two guys in a garage writing a financial document app. They don't tend to do as much input validation as they should, and so it's not anybody's fault. It's just the nature of the game. We don't find input validation issues as much on things like SharePoint or, Exchange admin on O365, just because Microsoft has unlimited resources, right? But these small application development shops, they don't have those resources. They don't have the budget to do, big dollar stuff. And so we end up finding scenarios. We were working with a company not too long ago, and we found SQL injection on their webpage, and it led us down into the database, right? Which we could then interact. Now we're interacting directly with a service running on the operating system. And, so we realize, wow, we have admin, whoever installed SQL installed it with admin privileges. So now we take over the server. Right. And then on that server were other credentials, and we start moving laterally, and our external pen test just became an internal pen test. And then we call Spencer and we're like, hey man, come help us out. But yeah, so what I love the most about this from a bad guy perspective is it's easy. Like you just go to the field and there's a handful of discovery techniques that you can use. And then you just pivot over to SQL map, right? If you're being lazy, if you want to be super cool, you can write your own custom exploit. Yep. But usually within hours, you have crafted a successful way to directly interact with SQL, if not the operating system.
Yeah, all the plugins for burp, for fuzzing the parameters in the fields and everything. It's amazing how many resources there are and plugins to automate the discovery of these things. And like you mentioned, SQL Map is another great tool to find these things. And like you said, it's never been easier to just automate a lot of this and then go manually start poking at things to dig deeper and validate those things, and then actually find out, oh yeah, that's either vulnerable or it's not, and then you move on to the next thing. So really good plugins and really good community projects built around discovering these types of vulnerabilities.
Absolutely agree. And, cross-site scripting is the same way. People look at me a little funny when I tell them I use cross-site scripting for initial access. But the reality is if I'm, and this happens the most in applications that you self-register on, right? So we were looking at one, and there was like a mailing list thing that somebody had written a couple of weeks ago, and you registered as a recipient, but then you could go in and you could send messages to other people that had registered. And so we just dropped cross-site scripting into the messaging part of the application and blasted it out to all the users. And then suddenly, we use Beef in a lot of cases, or a customized version of that exploit framework. If you're not familiar with that, it's B33F. And it's basically a Java-based C2 command and control. Anyway, we blasted it out, and we got like 40 or 50 people. Like sessions just started pouring into our Beef console, and we're just like, whoa, smokes, dude. And and some of those people had other tabs open, and because of the nature of the content security policy and lack of other security controls, we were able to start moving laterally into other applications. So yeah, cross-site scripting is a serious thing, man. And especially stored cross-site scripting, but even reflected cross-site scripting if you're using, messaging or email stuff. So
yeah, and one thing to keep in mind too is the same goes for credential attacks. These web application attacks, these exploits, these cross-site scriptings, SQL injections, things that give attackers code execution, particularly, are things that are very much sought after by ransomware groups, other threat actor groups. We're going to be talking on another podcast about initial access brokers, and their sole purpose is to find injection points in websites, in customers that these ransomware groups want to target, or they find credentials and then they sell them, right? So these injection points, these credential attacks, these are very big ticket items for initial access brokers and ransomware groups, and they're very sought after. And this is why we're talking about this, because of the impact of these things is so great. And we find these things so commonly around our pen tests.
Absolutely, man. And, just think about how many web apps you have in your organization, right? How many you use. It only takes one of them to improperly validate a field, and every user of that application is at risk. And in some cases, the underlying infrastructure is at risk. So yeah, these are a big deal. And it's amazing to me, by the way, we first started seriously talking about input validation in 2002, like on an enterprise level. So 20 years of cross-site scripting and SQL injection, right? I'm going to have a cake made just to celebrate those exploits, because they still work, by the way. So what can you do about it, right? So that's the real question is, we mentioned that a lot of times we think that these flaws exist because they don't have big budgets to do crazy security stuff, but you don't need to do big budget stuff, right? There are scanners out there like OWASP Zap that have built-in vulnerability scanning. It's a form of DAST. It's not perfect, but it's something, right? And it costs you nothing. We partner with Veracode for SAST and DAST, which is static scanning and dynamic scanning. Dynamic scanning is like, the web application's up and running. Static scanning is actually a compiled binary, and supporting libraries are scanned by an engine that look for flow problems. And so we use them for that, but there are others out there. There are free ones too, like open source bug scanners. The point is, do something, right? You don't have to spend a ton of money, but you can go train yourself. The Burp Academy, by the way, put out by Portswigger, who creates Burp Suite Pro, a tool that we use. Their Burp Academy is free. You can go learn how to do web pen testing, even at a rudimentary level, for absolutely nothing. And they offer a free version of Burp, by the way, you don't have to pay for.
Yep. It's
Great.
like everything else, same with internal pen testing things. A lot of things you can do for free, like Bloodhound, like my shirt, right?
Right. I noticed that, by the way.
You can run Bloodhound for free and find attack paths, and it doesn't cost you anything but your time and kind of researching, learning how to use it. So you can find a lot of low-hanging fruit just by doing some research and learning a little bit about these things. And then when you do get to a pen test, you're finding things that are more detailed, more hidden, things that are maybe a little bit more difficult to actually exploit, that you need somebody that has that experience and that knowledge of how to actually exploit those things and chain them together to show impact. But you can find a ton of stuff, low-hanging fruit, with just a little bit of research, a little bit of time learning these things, and some free tools. Really good way to just find some really easy low-hanging fruit.
Agreed, 100%. And if you're really interested in web application security or you're concerned about it, go look at OWASP, right? So I've been working with OWASP in some capacity as a volunteer for the entire 20 years I've been doing web app pen testing, and it's everything they do is free, right? That is literally their mission statement, is to put out awesome free stuff to make people better at app security. So go give them a check out and look at what they're doing, because they're doing a lot of really good stuff. So. Last one. And this one I was a little torn on, Spencer. So we rarely do this in the course of offensive operations, right? But it belongs on the list because its success rate is higher per capita than the other two combined, right? Let me explain. So what we're talking about is just sending out links and emails, right? I mean, we could probably just call it phishing, because that's what it is, right? Is we're phishing folks. Why is it at the bottom of the list if it has a higher hit rate? And it's just because we don't do it much. And Spencer and I were having this conversation, kind of, before the podcast. And what it comes down to is our attack is either going to be 100% successful or 0% successful. There is very rarely a question of success or failure when it comes to like red team phishing. So why is that the case? The reason that's the case is because you're either completely mature in your email defense, or with a little bit of money and time, we can bypass what you have. I'm going to elaborate on that because it sounds really presumptuous and like absolute. And it kind of is. If you're a small company and you don't have very good email defense, okay, I'm just going to go buy a recently expired top level domain that has a good reputation. I'm going to spin it over to G Suite, which takes minutes, by the way. And I think G Suite's $5 a month for the small business package. And so I'm going to spin it over and let that domain live in Gmail. And I am going to basically create a valid entity coming from a reputable source, Gmail, with a reputable domain, whatever I bought that already has good categorization. And then I'm just going to start sending emails to your users with links. Mm-hmm. And so I'm going to bypass all of your filtering at that point. Now, there are exceptions. Some filters actually look for like changes in domain registration, like there are exceptions to some of that. But generally speaking, unless you have a very mature email portfolio, we're going to get around it. And then if you don't, let me rephrase, if we don't, because you do have a massively mature, those people don't tend to be consumers of red team phishing testing, because they get phished every day. Because usually these are larger corporations that are just targeted constantly. So they're just, right now, the market doesn't seem to support it.
Yep. And one of the things too, you talked about buying a legitimate domain. You can even use legitimate sites that offer like the website builder sites, right?
Yeah,
or
Wix.
The sites or the sites that allow you to kind of write your own code, but it's on a legitimate website and you can host it, right? Mm-hmm. There's one the name is escaping me, but it's like Glitch or something like that. But there's sites where you can put your own code up there and you make like a fake login page, but it's hosted on the actual site. It's got a legitimate certificate.
Yeah. Heroku.
Yeah, Heroku is a good example. It's all fine and dandy, and a lot of times that will bypass the URL filtering that's done by those email security products. So when it clicks that link, it opens it up. It's like, oh yeah, it's a legitimate site. Good. Okay, pass it on to the user. Yeah. So yeah, there's a lot of ways to kind of bypass some of those things with a little bit of sophistication and a little bit of time and resources.
I agree. And for the most part, the bad guys are already doing this every single day, right? So you either know that you have weak email security, or you feel strong that your email security is squared away.
Yeah.
And in most cases, it is more cost effective for us to sit down and have a 2-hour meeting where we review your tech stack for
Yeah.
email security. And I can tell you just by looking at your tech stack if it's easy to get around or not. Instead of you paying me 3 days to go build out this infrastructure to perform phishing attacks against you.
Yeah.
And there are, by the way, just kind of as a side note, you got companies like KnowBe4 who we partner with for that, who do a great job of phishing. And so, there's just so much more effort and cost for a red team to spin up a phishing attack that we just don't get a lot of demand for it. And, I think that demand tapered off about 2 years ago, but before that, people were asking for it all the time.
Yep.
And we were trying to talk them out of it because we were like, look, dude, you're going to pay me X number of dollars and I am going to get into your network. The question is, how many of your users am I going to get? Right. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of how many. And so,
Yeah, and that's the thing is there's multiple questions that type of engagement serves to answer, right? Mm-hmm. First of all, can we get a payload in? Can we bypass those controls and get a payload in?
Yeah.
Is the user going to click on it, right? Is the user going to take the bait and perform some action? And then the third thing is, if that user performs that action, is it going to call out to MyC2? Is it going to execute code? Is the endpoint product going to block it? So phishing nowadays is very much multifaceted. And like you said, it's very expensive to do it against mature organizations. And the ones that are not are just, it's kind of, there's some hurdles to get through, but once you get through that, it's pretty much a given that something will execute and run.
I agree. And you mentioned something just now that kind of set off a light in my mind, and that was understanding the goals. Like, what is it that you're worried about that you want us to do phishing? And so usually what we discover is the customer's worried that, hey, we're not confident in the configuration of our tech stack for email defense. I'm like, okay, well then let's just go do that. Let's go fix that if you're worried about it. And let's be assured rather than this other thing. Or to your point earlier is, if I'm worried about endpoint security and initial access firing from email, well, then you need to do an endpoint assessment as part of an internal pen test. So again, this is just out of favor. It may come back, who knows? But for now, we've kind of parked this. But during its time, man, we were rocking and rolling and getting a lot of hits. So the biggest thing I can offer if you're worried about that is the things we talked about, but also find an email filtering vendor or tool or whatever that sandboxes and explodes attachments and URLs. Yeah. Right. At the very least, virus total checks. Yeah. As part of email filtering and evaluation. So, and that's it, man. I mean, that's usually the processes that we go through. Lots of success. And my favorite thing is almost all of these solutions cost little or no money.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. Everything from, testing users' passwords to setting up tools that you already have with Azure and password policies. From scanning with Burp, there's a community free version of Burp. There's a free version of Zap, obviously is free from OWASP. And then testing your email filters, send emails with specific attachments, specific documents, links, things like that through your email filter and see what gets blocked. So yeah, a lot of the stuff we talked about was all free and dandy and good starting points.
Love it. It's good stuff, man. I get excited about it. It's good topic.
Awesome. Cool. Well, that's all we have for today. That's our episode. So I hope you enjoyed it. If you got value from this, please share it with your friends, your network, your coworkers. Check us out on our blog at offsec.blog. Leave us a review, rating, all that fun stuff. And we hope you have a great day. Be awesome.
See you guys.